Chapter 623. Ever After 8. In the early morning hours, Seal woke up in her bed. There was still time left before the sun began to rise, but Seal was used to waking up at this hour. She sat up in bed, rolling her neck a few times, and then, after placing her feet together in front of her, she stretched her upper body forward. After she was done with that, Seal got out of bed and lightly stretched her body as she loosened her joints. Then she drank a glass of water that had been placed beside the bed before washing her face, brushing her teeth, and changing into a new set of clothes. Stepping out of her room, Seal quietly closed the door behind her. Most people were still asleep at this hour. She silently walked down the hallways that were kept illuminated with dimmed lights. Getting up and leaving her room at this hour was all part of Seal's daily routine. Even during her childhood, Seal had never once slacked off in her training, working hard to prove that she deserved to be born into the main line of the Lionheart clan. Back when the eldest son, Ued Lionheart, whose name was now forbidden even to be mentioned, had held the right to succeed the family, Seal had been driven to fight for her mother's approval and their position in the family. But then, so what if all of our hard work was aimed in the wrong direction? Seal muttered with a pout as she walked down the quiet hallway. It hadn't just been her. From a young age, both the twins had been hard workers, and it wasn't just for the sake of their mother's approval and their position in the main family. When they were 13 years old, in the now-defunct Lionheart tradition that was the bloodline continuation ceremony, they had competed against Eugene, who had shown them that an overwhelming gap existed between him and them before he was adopted into the main family. No, rather than competing. At that time they were only 13 years old. Meeting him at such a young age, the twins couldn't help but hold complicated feelings toward Eugene, a descendant of a collateral line who was far superior to those from the main line. If he had simply remained a part of the collateral lines, there wouldn't have been much for the twins to worry about, but Eugene had then become a foster child of the main family. Fortunately, Ancilla had a keen eye for reading the wind, so she chose not to show any hostility towards Eugene. She had sat the young twins down in front of her and told them they needed to become a real family to Eugene. The fact that they had seen Eugene's skills firsthand during the bloodline continuation ceremony also served as a blessing for the twins. Cyan had instinctively been drawn to Eugene's strength. Boys at that age tended to admire those stronger than themselves and wanted to become friends with them. But Cyan didn't just want to become friends. He wanted to become true brothers, and his pride as a noble young master made him want to catch up with Eugene no matter how hard he had to work for it. Seal also felt similarly. However, unlike Cyan, Seal was a girl. For Seal, who had only ever lived in the main house, which was filled with her blood-related family members, Eugene's sudden intrusion into their lives at such a young age had left her unable to hold anything more than a vague perception of him as a family member or a sibling. There had been too many missed opportunities. If only the awkward feelings brought about by her puberty had been less intense, or if Eugene hadn't gone to study abroad in Arath. Or maybe if she had followed Eugene instead of becoming a black lion, or if she had only acknowledged her feelings early on and confessed them to Eugene. If she had just made any type of concentrated effort. Seal laughed bitterly. There's still no way it would have worked out. If it had been in the past when she hadn't known the full circumstances, Seal might have believed otherwise, but the current Seal now knew a lot more about Eugene. No matter in which direction Seal might have chosen to devote her efforts, she still wouldn't have been able to receive the desired answer from Eugene. For Eugene, the past was something he would never be able to cast off, whether it was his connection to his comrades, his emotions accumulated in that life, or his unfulfilled regrets. No matter how desperately Seal confessed her love to him, Seal's feelings wouldn't have been able to reach Eugene. No matter how pretty the clothes she wore, no matter how many times she swung her sword in the training grounds every morning, no matter how much stronger she became as a result of all that, these efforts still wouldn't be able to grant Seal the response that she so desperately desired. Even now, after the war had completely ended, that was still the case. Seal wanted to become so much stronger because she wanted to fight alongside Eugene. Whether it was against the Demon King of Incarceration or the Demon King of Destruction, she had wanted to do her part in those battles and be of help to Eugene. But the distance between them had proved far too great. She hadn't been able to catch up to him in time. Seal's only significant contribution during those battles was to use her Demon Eye of Darkness to summon Molan. In the battle against the Demon King of Incarceration, she had defeated many demon folk and demonic beasts. In the battle against the Demon King of Destruction, she had also brought down many of the Nur. But that was all she had managed. Seal still hadn't been able to stand on the same battlefield as Eugene. In both battles, Seal's position had always been the same. She had only fought on the battlefields that were far away from the Demon Kings. So she had been left with no choice but to wait while hoping that Eugene would return after slaying the Demon Kings. Phew, Seal let out a deep sigh. The war was over. And there wouldn't be another such war for hundreds of years from now. No, even if a war did break out somewhere on the continent, there wouldn't be any need for Eugene to be there, so naturally that meant Seal also wouldn't get another chance to fight alongside him. Yet even so, Seal still woke up in the early hours of the morning every day, changed her clothes and headed out to the training grounds. Was it because of her many regrets? Did she perhaps still harbor some faint hope? Was it a desire to become stronger regardless of the situation? Or was it simply out of habit? Even Seal herself didn't know the exact reason for her behavior. She just naturally woke up at this time without even meaning to, and when she tried to go back to sleep, her sleep was uneasy, and if she skipped her early morning training, her body felt heavy. So was it just because of habit in the end? Seal headed towards the stairs with a wry smile on her face. Seal hummed, sensing a presence in the study near the hallway. With a little bit of focus, she was able to detect the identity of that presence, so instead of heading down the stairs, she first walked over to the study. In the Lionheart's main estate, even a study boasted a size comparable to a small library. Vermouth was standing near a bookshelf as he read a book instead of sitting down to read it. He raised his head as he heard the sound of gentle knocking coming from the door. "Please come in," Vermouth called out. Seal carefully cracked open the door and peeked her head through the gap. She blinked her eyes bashfully as she looked at Vermouth, then she grinned and said, "Hello, Uncle." "Ha." Vermouth let out a long sigh at this playful greeting. He shook his head and muttered, "I still can't get used to that title. Isn't it better than calling you father? Or perhaps, would you prefer to be called grandfather instead?" Seal cheekily asked. "It would be better if you could just call me by my name," Vermouth requested resignedly. "There's no way I could do something like that," Seal said, shaking her head. "You are the founding ancestor of the Lionheart clan after all, Uncle." "But you calling me uncle still feels a little," Vermouth trailed off awkwardly. "Since the patriarch doesn't have any older brothers, there's no one else who I can call uncle, to. Besides, doesn't me calling you that truly make us feel like family?" Seal said with a giggle as she stepped into the study. Following the dinner they had shared a week ago, Carmen had been calling Vermouth her father while Seal had been addressing him as uncle. "Am I perhaps bothering you?" Seal politely asked. "Not at all," Vermouth assured her. "Are you having trouble sleeping? Or maybe is there anything about the main estate that's making you uncomfortable?" Seal cautiously inquired. "No, it's nothing like that. I usually don't sleep much," Vermouth admitted as he held up the book he was reading, "and there are a lot of interesting books here." The book Vermouth was holding summarized the history of the Lionheart clan, and it had never been circulated outside of the family. Seal's eyes sparkled with interest. As a descendant of the main family, Seal had naturally read that book several times from a young age. "Uncle, are you curious about what happened to the family after you passed away?" Seal asked with some slight hesitation. "I wonder if I even have the right to be curious about that," Vermouth said as he sat down on a chair with a bitter smile. As he stared at the book he had set down on the desk in front of him, Vermouth remained silent for a few moments. Vermouth of 300 years ago definitely hadn't been a good husband, nor had he been a good father. Vermouth had had more than a dozen wives and fathered dozens more children, but not one of them had received any more affection than any of the rest, nor had he shown them any special interest. Vermouth's children had all been forced to work hard to escape the shadow of their father's glory, of the hero who had been titled the Great Vermouth. At the same time, they had longed for the affection and attention of their father, whom they couldn't help but admire deeply. Some of his children must have surely resented their heartless father. They would definitely have been dissatisfied with the gap between the main line and the collateral lines that Vermouth had established all that time ago. However, none of them had dared to confront Vermouth openly about his policies. That was all because their father was the Great Vermouth. "There wasn't even a single bad line written about me," Vermouth muttered with a wry sense of shame. Was it out of respect for their father that they hadn't left any trace of their resentment? Or perhaps they had wanted the future generations to believe that their ancestor was some kind of perfect genius. Do you regret your past? Seal tilted her head in curiosity as she sat down across from Vermouth. Unable to take his eyes off the book lying closed in front of him, Vermouth eventually spoke up. Back then, I had no choice but to do what I did. Even if I could return to the past, I would still do the exact same things. The Lionheart clan had been created in order to reincarnate Hamel. Everything Vermouth had done was to increase the probability of Hamel's reincarnation because he didn't know just how long it would take. He had also ensured the clan's growth and expansion so that it could serve as Hamel's ally. So even if he were to return to the past, Vermouth would still fashion the clan in the same way. So, Uncle, even someone like you still has regrets, Seal sighed. As long as they're human, everyone has regrets. It's only a question of how many, Vermouth said as he lifted his gaze away from the book to look ahead at the person sitting in front of him. Seal was one of his descendants, born 200 years after his apparent death. She was a direct descendant of the main line. But aside from that, Seal was also someone who held a special connection to Vermouth. Vermouth stared at Seal's left eye, which appeared a little cloudy compared to her right eye. The demon eye residing there had been awakened by Vermouth. During the battle against the new Demon King of Fury, when Eugene's consciousness had been sucked into the void during the Moonlight Sword's rampage, the chains of the Demon King of Incarceration had been needed to calm the rampage, and Seal had connected with Eugene to free his consciousness from the void. In the process of doing so, the demonic factor that Seal had inherited through her Lionheart blood had been activated. Vermouth was responsible for that activation. He had been wary of activating the demonic factor in Eugene's blood, as it might arouse a backlash from Eugene's innate divinity, so Vermouth had used Seal's blood instead as she happened to be there with Eugene. I have done you a grave injustice as well, Vermouth confessed with a long sigh. Back then when you two were at sea, I didn't even consider the future consequences of what I did to you. Even though I knew that you could die from the sudden backlash of the demon eye that was transplanted into you, I still... It's fine, Seal said, rubbing her left eye. At first I didn't know what was going on, but it all worked out in the end, right? I actually like having this demon eye. Right at the moment when Eugene had woken up from the Moonlight Sword's rampage and had yet to gain full control of his body, the Demon King of Fury had taken advantage of that opening and launched an attack targeting Eugene. Seal had thrown herself in front of the blow in order to save Eugene and had lost her left eye as a result of her sacrifice. At that time I just thought of this demon eye as a gift from you, Uncle. Thanks to it, I was still able to help Eugene even though my strength was severely lacking, Seal said gratefully. Vermouth stared at her silently. So there's no need to feel any guilt for what you did to me, Seal said with a giggle as she leaned closer to Vermouth. More importantly, there are a lot of stories that I want to hear from you, Uncle. Vermouth raised an eyebrow and asked, what kind of stories? Just what kind of person was Eugene? Seal asked, her eyes sparkling with interest and curiosity. Vermouth tilted his head to one side, considering this unexpected question. Haven't you already heard stories about Hamel many times before? From sources other than myself, such as Sienna, Anise, and Molin. But I'm sure that every one of you has a different impression of him. I'm curious about what kind of impression you got from him, Uncle, Seal explained. Uncle, you and Eugene have always paid a lot of attention to each other, haven't you? I've heard that Eugene has always considered you his rival and always wanted to win against you at least once during his previous life. My impression, Vermouth said, slowly tapping his fingers on the table as he considered his answer for a few moments. Setting aside what I knew of Hamel's past life, the impression that I had when I first saw him was that he was, well, a thug. A thug. Seal repeated in confusion. Vermouth began to explain, at that time, I only had 3 companions at my side, Molin, Sienna, and Anise. Meanwhile, Hamel was just someone who made quite a name for himself in the world of mercenaries. I used his reputation as a flimsy excuse to explain why I was intent on taking Hamel as my new companion. So what happened next? Seal eagerly pressed. Vermouth shook his head. Sienna and Anise both had reservations. Molin and I were strong enough that they didn't see the need for another warrior who could fight in close combat. And at that time, the impression people had of the mercenary profession wasn't very good. On top of that, Hamel's reputation was, well, let's just say that he wasn't famous for the right reasons. There was no need for Vermouth to search his memories. He could still remember his first meeting with Hamel as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. Vermouth fondly recalled, during our first meeting Hamel was beating up a group of knights. And why was he doing that? Seal asked in confusion. Hamel had been looking for a ship that would take him across the sea to the Devildom. The conflict started because the knights had mocked Hamel while they were in the midst of negotiations, Vermouth carefully explained. Unable to say anything in response to this, Seal just blinked her eyes in surprise. Vermouth continued, Hamel broke a limb on each of the knights and confiscated their weapons. Once he was done, I approached Hamel. And then what? Seal leaned forward eagerly. I invited him to share a meal. We couldn't just have a conversation in the middle of the street surrounded by all those onlookers after all. So we headed into a restaurant together, and while we were eating, I asked him to become my comrade, Vermouth slowly recounted. What did he say in response? Seal asked, absorbed in the story. Vermouth hesitated. How should I put this in a more polite way? There's no need to censor the story for my sake, Seal quickly insisted. Vermouth hesitated for a few more moments before eventually continuing in the most polite tone he could manage. He said that he didn't want to listen to the orders of some scrub who was weaker than he was. Ahaha. Seal couldn't help but burst into laughter at these words, clutching her sides as she doubled over. So even in the past he still had the same trashy personality that he has now? I think that he's actually become much gentler nowadays. After he became a member of our party, Sienna and Anise were always trying to beat Hamel's personality into shape, Vermouth said with a smile as he looked at Seal. Being reincarnated and having to start a new life may also be responsible for the changes in Hamel's personality. I could never have imagined that Hamel would actually be willing to kneel down in front of his father. That's for sure, Seal agreed. When I first met Eugene when I was younger, he was even more of a jerk than he is now. And how did that go? Vermouth asked. Seal shook her head and said, after my brother teased him a little, Eugene immediately challenged him to a duel. My brother got knocked down in a single hit and was made to cry while throwing up. Just like Vermouth, Seal was also able to remember her very first meeting with Eugene clearly. As he was watching Seal giggle at the memory with one hand over her mouth, Vermouth asked, Do you like Hamel? Seal's laughter came to a sudden stop. She blinked her eyes a few times as she stared back at Vermouth. The silence was short-lived. Yes, Seal responded without even the slightest hesitation. Seal still regretted not trying to get just that little bit closer to Eugene in the past. Even though she knew that even if she did return to the past, she still wouldn't be able to close the distance between them. But as Vermouth had said, everyone has regrets to a certain extent, but there was no way to redo what had happened in the past. I know that I won't be able to get the answer I want from him. However, I don't want to give up. If I give up, Seal paused before continuing. If I give up, then I think I will just regret it even more later on. Seal still woke up every morning to swing her sword as if out of habit. No matter how much stronger I get by continuing to swing my sword, I will never be able to catch up to Eugene, Seal admitted. But even though I may only ever be able to keep chasing Eugene's back, I will still keep swinging my sword from now on. Because if she kept swinging her sword until the sun had fully risen, Eugene, who had finally woken up from his sleep, would walk over to talk to her. Seal loved those moments. I don't want to fall behind where I can't even see his back. No matter how far out of reach he might be, I still want to be able to keep up with him. That way, if I can just do that, there might be times when Eugene turns around to look back at me, Seal said, self-consciously blinking her eyes. But surprisingly, there was no sign of tears. No, I'll keep following him so desperately that he has no choice but to turn and look back. Instead of feeling sad, Seal surprisingly felt relieved. The gloomy feeling that had been hovering over her before she had entered the study had disappeared. Seal smiled and said, Uncle, do you think I'm being stupid? There's no way I would think that, Vermouth said, shaking his head, a faint smile also on his face. Seal, there is no reason to laugh at you for holding on to your wish. After all, doing so just means that you never gave up or gave in to despair, isn't that right? Maybe it's because I got slapped for doing so in the past, Seal said with a grin as she rubbed her cheek. A faint ray of light streamed in from the window near the desk. Seal glanced out the window to see that the sun had already risen at some point during their conversation. I should be heading off now, Seal excused herself. Are you going to do some sword swings? Vermouth asked. Yes, Seal nodded. If it's all right with you, would you like me to take a look at your swings? Vermouth offered. Of course I'm all right with that, Seal said, getting up from her chair with a bright smile. Since you've listened to me talk and offered to look at my sword swings, does that mean I can assume you're cheering me on, Uncle? We're family after all, Vermouth said, returning her smile with his own as he also got up from his chair. You should head over to the training grounds first. I'll be there right after I'm done changing. All right. Seal cheered as she quickly spun around and left the study. Vermouth, who was left on his own once more, muttered to himself as he picked up the book that he had placed on the desk and returned it to its place on the bookshelf. Really now? In his previous life, Hamel hadn't been very popular with women. That was because he had a violent personality, a rough tongue and a face covered in scars. Sienna and Anise, who had both spent a long time fighting alongside him as comrades, had developed feelings for Hamel. But from a general perspective, Hamel wasn't really the type to be popular with women. But nowadays, to think that he would be reincarnated with such a handsome face, Vermouth sighed ruefully. Of course, Seal's feelings for Eugene weren't just because of his handsome appearance, but his looks must have also played a bigger role in her infatuation. Especially when one took into account the fact that the hundreds of boxes of love letters that had to be burned at the Lionheart main estate every single day were all due to Eugene's heroics and handsome face. It seems that you also have a lot to repent for, Hamel, Vermouth said, shaking his head as he left the study. Chapter 624. Ever After, 9. Any plans of getting married? Kaghyuk. This sudden question had Eugene coughing up the mouthful of alcohol he had just been about to swallow. The eruption came without any warning, but proving that all of his previous training hadn't been for nothing. Cyan reacted calmly and immediately leaned his chair backward to avoid the splash. Kahyuk gok. However, Eugene couldn't deal with the violent coughing fit with as much grace as Cyan. The strong alcohol that flowed back up from the inside of his throat stung both his nose and eyes. Why would you suddenly ask me that? Eugene protested. It's not like my question is that unwarranted, Cyan replied, allowing his tilted back chair to slowly fall onto all fours. They were currently in Cyan's room. Eugene had taken the seat across from Cyan after the latter had invited him to share a late drink between brothers, just the two of them. So how could Eugene have expected Cyan to suddenly spring such a question onto him? Eugene wiped his mouth with the back of his hand as he glared at Cyan and growled, "Who told you to ask me that?" What? Cyan awkwardly feigned ignorance. I said, who told you to ask me that? Eugene repeated himself. Was it the patriarch, Lady Ancilla? Or could it perhaps have been my father? Ahem, Cyan cleared his throat as he looked away. No. Hold on. It might have been one of the others, Eugene muttered as he narrowed his eyes. Gluck gluck gluck. Pouring out the brown spirit once more into his empty glass, Eugene considered the possible candidates. In addition to the adults of the main family who were the first to come to mind, there were far too many people who might have ordered Cyan to float the idea of marriage to Eugene. There was Signard, who was currently living in the forest. Although they were of different races and were born to different parents, Signard and Sienna saw each other as siblings. He could be a bit of a doting idiot when it came to matters involving Sienna, and there were several times when he had teamed up with the other elves living in the forest to put some pressure on Eugene and Sienna to advance their relationship. There was also Lovelian and Melkith. A few days ago, they had come to visit the Lionheart's main family while claiming to be acting as the representatives of Aroth regarding the new city. Eugene had been present for their arrival, and they had started off their greetings with some light conversation that had included some discussion about the new city and its academy that was soon to be inaugurated. Next up were Alchester and Raphael. They had also arrived at the Lionhearts for reasons similar to the ones the wizards had given. One of the reasons for their visit was to convey their respective emperor and pope's request to continue to maintain their current friendly relations with the Lionhearts. But Alchester had also asked, without any warning, about the age range for students to be admitted to the academy. Eugene had thought that this was because Alchester wanted to enroll his son, Leo Dragonic, who was just over 13 years old, into the academy, but that wasn't the case. It was Alchester himself who wished to enroll into the academy. While they do say that the pursuit of learning has no requirements on status or age, it was still impossible for Alchester, the commander of Kiel's Imperial Knights, to enter the academy. Fortunately, Raphael at least didn't seem to have any intention of trying to enroll in the academy personally. Instead, he was interested in the theology course, which was currently under consideration to become one of the subjects taught by the academy. Raphael had said that if the academy needed his help, he was willing to leave his duties in the Knights of the Blood Cross behind to teach the theology course, but Eugene had declined without any hesitation. If a die-hard fanatic like Raphael were to teach them theology, his students would surely become the same type of fanatics as well. Anyways, coming back to the current problem, it might have also been King Aman. After all, hadn't Sion visited the kingdom of Ruhr accompanying Isla a few weeks ago? There were many other suspects apart from those Eugene had already considered. It would only be a slight exaggeration to say that the entire continent was interested in Eugene's goings-ons, particularly since celebrity marriages was a popular topic that could be eagerly discussed even in the local bar. If someone wanted to ask, they could just ask you directly. Why would they approach me and task me with asking you that question? Sion tried to argue. Eugene snorted in disbelief. Why? Because we're brothers, that's why. If it's between brothers, well, of course you might say things you wouldn't say to anyone else. Brothers? Sion gasped, his eyes widening. Feeling greatly moved by this affirmation of their brotherhood, Sion raised his glass in a toast and clinked it against Eugene's. So who was it? Eugene pressed. Sienna, Anise, or Kirstina? Sion scoffed, saying, if it's those three, they would definitely have just confronted you directly. Indeed, that does sound like them. So tell me, who was it? Eugene asked impatiently. Sion hesitated, seemingly finding it difficult to give up the answer. But his ambiguous attitude was only making Eugene feel even more frustrated. Eugene clinked his glass against Sion's as he urged his brother once more. Just tell me who it was. It was Isla, Sion murmured in a low voice. Who? Eugene frowned. Sion raised his voice. I said it was Isla. Eugene hadn't expected her name to come up as the culprit. Isla Ruhr, a descendant of Molin, the daughter of King Aman, princess of the kingdom of Ruhr and Sion's fiancée, that Isla? Eugene blinked as he thought of Isla, whom he had seen in the mansion hallway a while earlier. She did bear a striking resemblance to both Molin and Aman and looked incredibly precocious for a 13-year-old. Young master. Whenever they met, Isla would always smile brightly and address Eugene by that formal title. Could you tell me where Big Sis Mare and Big Sis Mir are, please? But her precociousness was only in terms of her appearance. Isla's mental age was still the same as her actual age. Perhaps that was why, in a rare case for them, Mare and Rymira both chose to act as elders in front of Isla. Why would Miss Isla ask about that? Eugene eventually got over his shock and asked. She's very interested in your marriage, Sion revealed. Eugene furrowed his brow and asked, for what reason? Sion shyly admitted, Isla said that before we eventually get married to each other, it would be better if you got married first. It seems like she wants to take notes from it. Take notes? Eugene slowly repeated. About what kind of ceremony it was and what the bride should wear, and also. Sion hesitated for a moment, unable to continue, before finally downing his neglected glass of alcohol and finishing what he'd been trying to say. She also wants to catch the bouquet. The bouquet. Eugene swallowed a nervous gulp. Sion's wedding was already scheduled for when Isla turned 20. Judging from the fact that she wanted to take notes on the wedding process and was eager to catch the bouquet, it seemed that Isla's feelings for Sion were more serious than Eugene had previously believed. In fact, if one set aside the difference in age and just judged them based on their appearances, they did look good together. For now, at least. Freewebnovel.com. Isla's height might still be shorter than Sion's, but what if the Ruhr blood that she had inherited from Molin and Aman were to awaken over the course of the next few years? Eugene was reminded of Garjitha's younger sister, whom he had met in the main house at a previous family event, and how she had sported bulging muscles just like her older brother. What's with that expression? Sion asked suspiciously. Ahem, Eugene coughed as he carefully examined Sion's expression. But are you two really going to be getting married? Probably, Sion said with a shrug. But your engagement was ultimately something the Patriarch and Lady Ancilla decided for you, wasn't it? Apart from Miss Isla, there was also. Eugene trailed off awkwardly. Sion finished what Eugene had been about to say. The other candidate was Princess Scalia. Nowadays, Scalia had become a devout believer who worshipped Eugene as her god, But when they had first met, she had just finished slaughtering a group of mercenaries in the snowfield and had attacked Eugene, her eyes rolling in her head due to the stress and the constant nightmares she was suffering. At that time, Cyan, who hadn't been able to decide between Isla and Scalia, had immediately picked Isla as his fiancée after witnessing the scene that Scalia had left in the snowfields. Cyan set down his glass and said, "It seems like you might be misunderstanding something, but I am sincere in my intentions to marry Isla." Cyan's expression was solemn as he said this, but upon seeing this expression, Eugene couldn't help but shoot him a look filled with even more suspicion. Could it be? No, never mind, Eugene shook his head. Cyan groaned in exasperation. "I told you to stop it with the misunderstandings. Who said that I wanted to get married right now? Once Miss Isla turns 20, you'd be 30 years old, Eugene pointed out. If Isla really doesn't want to marry me, then there's no way I would go along with it. That's not just for now, it will apply after 7 years as well. But right now she bursts into tears if I even bring up the idea of possibly breaking off our engagement." Cyan spat out, his shoulders shaking just from the memory of it. She was crying like the world was about to end, so what else was I supposed to do? I had to say something to comfort her. So I told her I was sorry and promised that I definitely wouldn't break our engagement. Cyan took a moment to calm himself before sighing. However, after 7 years have truly passed, Isla might still change her mind. She might not want to marry a middle-aged man 10 years older than her. Eugene snorted in amusement. If a 30-year-old is middle-aged, then what am I, a grandfather? No, maybe I would count as an undead. Cyan huffed. "Stop speaking in circles and tell me, when exactly are you going to get married?" Eugene clicked his tongue at this sharp retort and took a moment to think about it seriously. "About a year from now? What's with the vague time of a year? If you're going to do it, you should just do it right away," Cyan encouraged. "Is marriage truly something that you should jump into right away just because you've decided to do it? I also need some time to prepare myself mentally," Eugene protested. "Preparation as if," Cyan snorted in disbelief. "In any case, I'll get to it in about a year," Eugene stubbornly insisted. "And who will you be getting married to?" Cyan asked, delivering yet another extremely sharp question. As Eugene awkwardly avoided meeting Cyan's eyes, his lips sealed tightly shut. Cyan clicked his tongue several times before muttering, "Lady Sienna, Lady Anise, or Lady Christina? Which of them are you going to choose?" Eugene hesitantly replied, "All of them, all together?" Cyan's face twisted in disgust at this barely reasonable answer. Before Cyan could part his sneering lips to actually say something, Eugene quickly added, "All 3 of them want to marry me in any case, and I also think that it would be good to do so. Also, rather than marrying Sienna a year from now on, then marrying Anise a year later and finally marrying Christina a year after that, I feel like it would be better to do it all at once." "There's a lot that I want to say about that," Cyan slowly began, but instead of erupting into curses, he let out a long sigh. "You might actually have a point with what you're saying. But has Lady Sienna agreed to this plan of yours?" Eugene cleared his throat. "She sort of agreed." "Why do you keep giving such vague responses?" Cyan complained. "That's why I said that I need about a year. That gives me time to sort out everything I need to sort out, and I can definitely get her permission with that much time." Eugene blurted out his excuse. "You're insane." Cyan let out another sigh as he shook his head. "But even so, well, I guess it would be quite a joyous affair. Isla would also probably enjoy it as it gives her more chances to catch the bouquets. We'll be throwing all 3 of them at the same time, so tell her to do her best to catch them all," Eugene said encouragingly. "If you're going to throw 3 of them, why don't you throw one over to Seal?" Cyan suggested. Eugene choked on his drink once more. Gag. Once again Eugene sprayed out a mouthful of alcohol, and Cyan had to quickly tilt his chair backward to avoid being sprayed. Eugene stammered, For a while now I've noticed that vermouth seems to be getting closer to Seal. Do you know what's going on with that?" He was trying to change the subject to something else. Cyan looked at Eugene with a pitying expression, then slowly shook his head. "Why are you asking me when you could be asking him? Also, you can tell just by looking at them. He's been watching over her training every day for a while now." "But why all of a sudden?" Eugene plaintively questioned. Cyan shrugged, saying, "It's not like he's only giving guidance to Seal. He's also given me some good advice as well." "Are you suggesting that he might be a better teacher than me?" That bastard, even in the past he had no clue how to teach someone, Eugene complained. Cyan sniffed and avoided answering the question. It is an honor that he's even willing to guide us. Eugene just smirked and said, it seems like he's still as bad at teaching as ever. At least he's a lot friendlier than you were during our past lessons, Cyan said, clicking his tongue at those old memories as he set down his glass. We should finish our drinks with this. Tomorrow is an important day after all, so we can't just drink the whole night away. The following day, the Lionheart's new city would finally be complete and ready to be moved into. Since a new mansion had already been constructed in the new city, they had decided to leave the mansion that they had been residing in on its current site. Since this mansion had 300 years of history associated with it, they had decided to use it as a villa that would also serve as a museum for future generations. Who did you say would be attending the inauguration ceremony again? Eugene asked Cyan to remind him. From the Lionhearts, there will be everyone from the Council of Elders, the Black Lions, and the most influential families among the collateral lines, Cyan recalled. And besides the Lionhearts, there will be the general staff who served in the Divine Army, monarchs from the various countries, and other high-ranking nobles. Eugene raised a brow. Is that all? Cyan wryly shook his head as he muttered, hundreds of thousands of people have already gathered to wait outside the city gates since a few days ago. The inauguration ceremony of the Lionheart's new city was receiving a lot of attention from all across the continent. At tomorrow's inauguration ceremony, those currently residing in the Lionheart's main estate would be the very first to step foot in the city. After that, they would tour the new mansion as well as the city's landmarks, accompanied by a few specially invited guests. After a short ceremony, the city gates would finally be opened. The hundreds of thousands of people who had been gathering outside the city for the past few days would then be allowed through the open gates to tour the city independently. To think that you would actually select the new residents by lottery. Isn't that far too radical? Cyan asked in concern. Eugene reassured him, it's not like we're just going to pick anyone. When choosing the residents of their new city, they had decided to give priority to the soldiers of the Divine Army who had fought in the war. They had also decided to hold a lottery for the demon folk and human immigrants who had previously lived in Pandemonium, as well as anyone from the rest of the continent who hoped to immigrate over. But you also said that you would hold a separate lottery for the crowds of people attending the inauguration ceremony tomorrow. If you're not careful, a disaster could occur, Cyan warned. We'll do our best to keep things under control so that nothing like that happens, Eugene promised. If the hundreds of thousands of people waiting outside the city were allowed to rush in all at once, it would only be natural for there to be chaos. On top of that, if they held the lottery right in front of them, the excited crowd might cause quite a commotion. Thankfully, they had already prepared measures to prevent that. It's finally happening tomorrow, Eugene sighed, a pleased smile on his face as he got out of his seat. As Cyan had said, tomorrow was an important day, so Eugene also agreed to end their drinking session here and just head back to his room. You were pretending to be calm, but it seems like you're also looking forward to it, aren't you? Cyan asked with a smirk. The members of the Lionheart's main family had first set eyes on the new mansion that had been built for them in the new city a few days ago. Cyan, in fact, didn't have any complaints about the mansion they were currently living in. But after seeing the mansion that had been built for them in the new city, his heart couldn't help but flutter in excitement. Of course, I'm looking forward to it, Eugene replied with a similar smirk. However, Eugene's anticipation wasn't because of the new mansion or the inauguration of the new city. He had other plans for tomorrow. Eugene hid his excitement as he left Cyan's room. As he was heading down the hallway on the way back to his rooms, he ran into Anise and Christina. Are you really going to bed now? Anise asked with a pout. When Anise, who had successfully transferred her soul into a doll's body, stood next to Christina, the duo looked like twins. Aside from the slightly different air that each of them gave off, the only differences between them were Christina's teardrop mole and the style of clothes that they wore. Eugene could recognize who was who without any problems, but they looked so similar that other people couldn't help but get them confused. It had been suggested that at least one of them should tie up their hair so that it would be easier to identify who was who, but Anise had firmly refused the suggestion. Given her teasing nature, it seemed like she enjoyed being able to confuse others. Where's Sienna? Eugene asked. She's still out in the forest, Anise answered. She said that she had to check on the teleportation spell she'll be using tomorrow. Eugene nodded, saying, well, it would be a big deal if that spell were to fail. Even if they were leaving the mansion on its current site, the main family still had an extraordinary amount of luggage that needed to be moved. On top of that, Sienna also had to warp the entire forest as well as the dwarven workshop all the way to the new city. During this last month, while the city had been under construction, Sienna had been obsessed with refining and double-checking her huge-scale warp spell. Since everyone living in the main estate would be moving to the new city by going through the usual warp gates, there was no need to worry about the possibility of any casualties. Still, if any of the luggage or the trees of the forest, especially the saplings of the world tree, were lost due to warp failure, it would be an irreversible disaster. Christina shook her head. But there's no way that Lady Sienna's spell would actually fail, would it? Still, I feel like I should go and help her out a bit, Eugene argued. Anise said with a snort. When you went over to help last time, didn't Sienna end up chasing you away? Instead of needlessly going over there to bother her, you should just get some sleep. Then what are you two up to instead of sleeping? Eugene pointed out. There wasn't really any need to wait for an answer because they were absolutely reeking of alcohol. Ever since Anise had possessed her doll, the two of them had spent every day drinking together. Sometimes, Seal would be dragged away to join them once she was done with her training. Anise cheerfully grinned, saying, we're just getting a bit more to drink. Christina sighed, I don't really want to drink tonight, but sister says that she still hasn't had enough wine yet. That's a blatant lie, Anise accused. The one who tempted me to head down to the kitchens because we didn't have enough drinking snacks was you, Christina, isn't that right? While the two were bickering, Eugene stealthily tried to sneak away. Because he knew that if he stayed here any longer, the two were sure to grab hold of him and force him to come and drink with them. Sir Eugene should come with us, Christina suddenly suggested. Anise complimented her. That's a great idea, Christina. Since Sienna isn't here right now, the two of us can monopolize Hamel. Before Eugene could back away any further, Christina and Anise grabbed hold of Eugene's arms. If they were still limited to a single body, he would have been able to shake them off somehow, but now... Eugene gulped as he felt the soft pressure of their chests enveloping both of his tightly held arms. Just as Eugene was about to be dragged down the hallway by the two saints, the door of Vermouth's room cracked open slightly as he peeked out to ask them, "Why aren't you all sleeping yet?" Vermouth took in the look on Eugene's face, which was pale and locked into a frightened grimace, and then turned to Christina and Anise, whose faces were red from tipsiness but with a gleam of desire shining in their eyes before clicking his tongue in disapproval. "Hey, why don't you come and drink with us?" Eugene quickly called out, looking to Vermouth for help. "No thanks," Vermouth said without giving it a second thought. Vermouth had the gut feeling that if he got dragged along to wherever they were going, he would be forced to drink until morning, and it would also place him right in the firing line for Anise and Christina's eventual revenge. The two saints' smiles deepened at Vermouth's response. "Good night, Sir Vermouth." "Sweet dreams, Sir Vermouth." The two saints left with these greetings as they continued to drag Eugene away. "Hey!" Just as Vermouth was about to close the door behind him, a sudden shout had him turning back to look at Eugene. Eugene glared at Vermouth with narrowed eyes as he continued speaking. "You should look forward to tomorrow." Vermouth frowned, unable to understand the intention behind these words. Chapter 625. Ever After, 10. Bonus images. Thank you for entrusting the city's construction to our Giabella Construction Company. Noir said with a bow. Dozens of demon folk were lined up behind Noir, who was wearing a hard hat over a suit. With Noir's employees consisting of many different races of demon folk, each with their distinct differences, the group of demon folk was displaying a great array of different appearances. Among their number were a few succubi like Noir and also quite a few demons, the most common race of demon folk. The giants stood out from the rest with their huge bodies, and there were even a few demon folk with multiple pairs of arms. They were all part of the executive staff of Giabella Construction, and just like Noir, they were dressed in hard hats and suits, with the words Giabella Construction printed across each of their hard hats. "Now then," Noir said, holding her arms up high. At this gesture, the eyes of everyone attending the inauguration ceremony were drawn upwards. A huge curtain was hanging behind Noir and her executives. Noir savored the attention of each and every gaze that was fixed on the curtain behind her and announced with a bright smile, "Allow me to reveal the Lionheart's new mansion." Fwaish. As the curtain drew back, a large mansion was revealed. Pam 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 pam. Boom 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 boom. Fireworks soared into the sky amidst the loud fanfare before erupting in a colorful and flowery display that covered the clear blue sky. Eugene and the rest of the main family had already seen the mansion several times while they were inspecting the construction, but not everyone who was attending the inauguration ceremony had seen the mansion before. There was an extended cry of amazement at the beauty and grandeur of the stately mansion. The previous Lionheart mansion had already been beautiful enough to rival any mansions belonging to the noble families on the continent, but this new Lionheart mansion was literally on a different level. Even the Emperor of Kiel, who owned several castles, was so shocked that his jaw dropped open speechlessly. Of course, the mansion wasn't as tall or as large as a castle or palace. This had been done because if one counted all of the main family members who regularly lived at the main estate, that number didn't even add up to 10 people. Even if one included the butlers and servants, the mansion was still only ever meant to house a few dozen. However, the size didn't matter as the finished mansion as a whole looked like a work of art. No, in fact, all of the sculptures decorating the mansion were actually works of art renowned all across the continent. Well then, where should I start with my introductions? If I were to explain the artistic intentions and origins of all my favorite features, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that I could keep talking about them for weeks. Or are you all perhaps curious about the functional features? The outdoor swimming pool perfectly replicates the beaches of Cernia Island, the most beautiful holiday resort in the whole continent. The open-air bath was inspired by the Liver Hot Springs, a famous attraction in Roer, and Noir began to deliver a long explanation. The dozens of guests invited to the inauguration ceremony were guided through the grounds of the mansion as they listened to Noir's explanation. But the outer appearance of the mansion wasn't the only noteworthy thing here. There was also the carefully landscaped forest growing around it. Behind the mansion, the saplings of the world tree stood tall as if they were standing guard, and they were surrounded by the other fairy trees, each of which was several times more valuable than their same weight in mithril. The guests could feel the perfect harmony that had been cultivated between the forest and the mansion. As Vermouth stood there silently, someone approached his side and said, "This took me a lot of hard work." It was the White Tower Master Melkith Al-Haya. The moment she approached him, Vermouth unconsciously took a few steps to the side to distance himself from Melkith. The impression that Melkith had left on him from their first meeting had been ingrained deeply into Vermouth. This was the spirit summoner who had chased after them while screaming when they had left the battlefield. The one who Sienna had cast a spell at and sent falling without any hesitation or mercy. At the time he couldn't understand why she would do such a thing, but now, during the time he spent at the main estate, Vermouth had come to know exactly what kind of person Melkith Al-Haya was. She might be similar to Carmen in a way, but at her core she was far more insane. Phew, Melkith pursed her lips and blew a kiss at him. The sweetly scented breath that she exhaled should have been too far away to reach Vermouth, but the wind spirit that was summoned by her will carried her breath over to him. Whoosh! Her breath, now reinforced by the wind, tickled Vermouth's ear. For Melkith, who held contracts with 4 spirit kings and could exert total control over any of the lower-ranking spirits, distance held no meaning when it came to blowing her kisses or whispers. "Dear one," Melkith whispered with a sickly sweet voice and smile. The touch of her breath and the way her whisper lingered in his ear sent goosebumps running throughout Vermouth's whole body. The way he hunched his shoulders and shakily glanced at Melkith made it seem like Vermouth was confronting some primal and ancient fear. "I did a lot of work. All for you, dear. And for the family," Melkith slowly whispered. "The family? Whose family?" Vermouth felt afraid because it wasn't quite clear which family Melkith was referring to. "You can feel it, can't you, dear? You were the greatest spirit summoner before I came along, after all." An incredible depth of spirit summoning expertise went into the design behind this mansion and its forest, Melkith proudly declared. Melkith was telling the truth. The successful construction of this mansion and the forest, no, of this entire city, was only possible thanks to the cooperation of Aratha's archwizards, and even among their number the Red Tower Master and the White Tower Master in particular had played significant roles. Led by Lovelian, the summoners of the Red Tower of Magic had provided much of the labor needed for the construction, and the spirit summoners of the White Tower of Magic had used their earth spirits to build the city's roads. Melkith had also devoted much of her time to creating the forest. Thanks to her, the spirits of the earth had been thoroughly taught how to keep the land fertile so long as the forest above wasn't somehow burnt down, and they had also been trained to arrange the growth of anything new that was planted so that it wouldn't mar the existing landscape. So anyways, dear, Melkitha's voice and the look in her eyes grew even more sickly sweet. As she took a step forward towards him, Vermouth had to swallow back a nervous gulp. Don't I deserve some praise? Melkitha's whisper was mixed with a note of wistful desire, her breath continuing to tickle the corners of his ears. The one who saved Vermouth from this human-shaped source of dizzying fear that was making him feel like he was suffering from vertigo was Carmen, who resolutely stepped forward to defend Vermouth. Don't get so close to my father, Carmen spat out, glaring at Melkith with eyes full of disgust. Melkith sniffed and said, Why are you calling my dear your father? Carmen narrowed her eyes. Why are you calling my father dear? But could this really be called salvation? Caught in the center of this verbal duel, Vermouth squeezed his eyes shut. Even as he tried to ignore what was happening around him, Carmen and Melkith continued to exchange fierce glares. Why was Carmen Lionheart calling the great Vermouth, the founding ancestor of her clan, father? And why was Melkith Elhaya addressing the great Vermouth as her dear? The honored guests who had been invited to the inauguration ceremony were very curious about the reasons behind such strange behavior, but no one dared to ask the participants directly. This was because both women looked to be taking this argument far too seriously for anyone to feel comfortable asking them what was going on, and the great Vermouth appeared too distressed to welcome any further disturbances. If I could, I would like to guide you through the interior of the mansion, which boasts a decor just as artistic as its exterior, but unfortunately that is meant to be the living space for the main family. There is also the issue of privacy, so please inquire separately with the members of the Lionheart's main family about viewing the inside of the mansion. Nor finished her long spiel with a bright smile. Now then, let us continue by touring the Lionheart's new city that is built around this mansion. Just like the Lionheart's previous mansion, their new mansion also had a warp gate installed on the grounds of the estate. This was necessary because the grounds of the new mansion were far too large for anyone to walk out of easily. As Eugene followed Noir, who was leading the tour group away while still wearing a hard hat, he suddenly asked a question. How are the preparations? They're all complete, Sienna replied. She had been sticking closely by his side. Although she had been up all night until early morning hours, preparing to teleport the entire forest, Sienna's face didn't show even the slightest trace of fatigue. She lifted her chin and proudly declared, Humph, who exactly do you think you're talking to? Of course I, Lady Sienna, finished preparing everything perfectly. There's no room for even a single mistake to be made, Eugene warned her. Don't worry about it. After all, you're not the only one who's been looking forward to this, Sienna assured him as she exchanged glances with Molan and Anise. Anise nodded back silently. Molan's expression was hidden behind his thick, bushy beard, but his fists were clenched in excitement and anticipation. I won't be participating in this, Christina responded when Sienna's eyes turned towards her. She had received their offer to be involved but refused their invitation, and Eugene had no intention of forcing her to participate. If you don't want to do it, it can't be helped. But if you do change your mind, you can join in any time, Eugene said with a bright smile as he looked back over his shoulder. Even now, Vermouth was being tortured to the point of insanity while he was caught between Carmen and Melkith. Stepping through the mansion's warp gate, they arrived at one of the city's many landmarks. The guests erupted in gasps upon arriving at their destination. Unlike the mansion, there wasn't a curtain hiding the sight from view. However, just like the last time, Noor held her arms up at the entrance to the landmark and shouted an introduction. This is the symbol of the Lionheart's new city. The only institution of its kind in the entire history of the continent. A place of learning that will pave the way to the future. This site was the only location in the new city that made use of as large an area as the Lionheart's new main estate. Magnificent buildings that looked like they had been copied from a royal palace had been built on this site. Noor suddenly shot Eugene an enthusiastic look. The other guests also seemed to be expecting him to step forward. Eugene hesitated amid this atmosphere of eager anticipation, only for Sienna to push him forward with a mischievous smile. What are you doing? Go ahead and give them an introduction to your new school, Sienna said teasingly. Eugene stumbled forward a few steps due to her push. He shot a resentful gaze back at Sienna, but sensing the many eyes directing eager looks of anticipation towards him, Eugene swallowed back the curses he had been about to blurt out. "This place is—" Eugene began to speak only to pause and clear his throat as he glanced back over his shoulder. Behind Eugene were 6 statues erected on the campus plaza that connected the various buildings together. The statues were of Eugene, Sienna, Molin, Anise, Christina, and Vermouth. The dwarven craftsman who had been living at the main estate had especially carved out these statues just for today. "The Dinah's Academy," Eugene finished announcing. Eugene had discussed with many people what to name his academy. At first he had just wanted to name it Lionheart Academy without giving it much thought, but Gilead had opposed this idea. He said that the Lionhearts had no intention of claiming ownership of the academy and that the name as a whole didn't fit the purpose of the academy or represent what the academy meant to Eugene. Since Lionheart Academy had been rejected, if he truly had to name it something else, Eugene wanted to name his academy something that sounded impressive and appropriate. However, all the names that Eugene suggested had been rejected by the various people he had spoken to. The only name that had finally made the cut after all the discussion was over and done with was Dinah's Academy. The name had been taken from Hamel's last name. It was just an idea that Eugene had mentioned without giving it much thought, but surprisingly, everyone had accepted it and thought it was a good idea. Vermouth had fathered the Lionheart clan. Molin had founded the Kingdom of Roer. Sienna had created the circle magic formula and was admired by all wizards. Anisa's deeds as a saint had even been recorded in Ura's religious scriptures, which meant that every future priest of Ura's would learn how to cultivate their faith through the life and writings of Anise that were passed down through these scriptures. However, Hamel hadn't left behind any legacy for the future generations. If one really had to pick something, there was the Hamel style that had been passed down through Geno's family, but that had actually been something left to them by Vermouth, not Hamel himself. Because of that, they all agreed to name this place Dinah's Academy. "This place is, Eugene awkwardly trailed off. He had prepared a lot of things to say in advance, but now that the time had come to actually say them, Eugene felt too embarrassed to do so. In the end, just like he had before, Eugene continued his speech by saying whatever came to mind. "Here you can learn a lot of things. It won't just be swordsmanship. There are all sorts of other weapons. You can also learn various types of magic and spirit summoning. Then there are pure theology courses. In the case of theology, we don't just teach the doctrine of the light. If you want to, you can also study the doctrine of war or victory, and once you graduate, or maybe as an internship. What I mean is that I'm thinking of making it possible for you to become a priest or a paladin. If you want to become a knight instead, you will need to take a course on your weapon of choice and another course on the subject of chivalry," Eugene hastily concluded. Although he may have just made it up on the spot, everyone had been listening intently to Eugene's speech. Eugene felt pressured by the intense silence of his captive audience, but he just continued to speak without stopping to think about it. "I also plan to include opportunities to study abroad, like with Aratha's Towers of Magic, as well as actively inviting experts in the various subjects to speak to the students, allowing students to make an informed choice on whether they want to further their studies in a subject. But for now, the Dinah's Academy that I have always wanted to create is a place where you can learn everything and become anything. Of course, their final outcome still depends on how hard the students are willing to work for it. But as the principal of Dinah's Academy, I will do my best to ensure that my students don't waste their precious youth and that they can realize their dreams for the future." A round of applause. More shouted as soon as Eugene had finished speaking. Pam pababam pam, pam pam. The fanfare everyone had heard earlier was played once more as fireworks shot up into the sky. Clap, clap, clap. Eugene felt embarrassed by the applause that all the guests were showering him with, and he quickly returned to the side of his companions. "Why are you crying again?" Eugene scolded Gerhard, who kept wiping away his tears with a damp handkerchief. However, unable to stop his tears, Gerhard simply stammered, Son, to think that my son would have such grand ambitions." "What do you mean, grand ambitions?" Eugene awkwardly mumbled. "To think that you wouldn't just be satisfied with saving the world, but would go on to try and make the work a better place," Gerhard sobbed into his handkerchief. Eugene tried to defend himself. "I never said anything like that." "But the more exceptional people there are, the better the world will become," Gerhard insisted. Just a quick glance around showed that Gerhard's reaction wasn't unusual. Gilead's eyes were also red, and it appeared as if he had been deeply moved by Eugene's speech. If you officially open a course on chivalry, might I be able to give a few lectures as a visiting professor? Alcester requested. I'll allow it if you also give my students a chance to train with the Knights of the White Dragon, Eugene counteroffered. As long as they're of sound mind and solid skill, I would be willing to take them on as full-time members, not just as trainees, Alcester said with a bright smile. I'm saying this just in case, but don't think that I'll favor Leo just because he's enrolling in the academy, Eugene warned. Of course that's how it should be, Alcester said with a quick nod. There's no need to think of him as my son. If Leo tries to use the Dragonic family's influence as a shield, please feel free to expel him immediately. As they were having this conversation, everyone had walked through the campus plaza and were about to enter the main building. Since the academy buildings were so large and spacious, it would be impossible to showcase and introduce everything in the time they had left, so everyone started moving separately after entering the main building. Where should we do it? Eugene asked. The plaza that we passed through earlier should be fine, Anise said. One of the classrooms would also work just as well, Eugene argued. Sienna shook her head and said, that wouldn't give it the right sense of openness, it needs to be done out in the open. Eugene couldn't help but tilt his head in confusion at Sienna's response. What was so important about being out in the open? In the end, as Anise had suggested, the campus plaza was confirmed as the location for their plan. Eugene nodded decisively and said, well then let's get a move on. After looking around the academy for 30 minutes, the tour group was ready to move on once more. Noir continued to act like a skilled tour guide, her mouth constantly moving without a moment's rest. The place we're headed to now is the Dwarven Industrial Zone. That is where the Dwarven artisans who originally lived on the Lionheart estate, as well as the other dwarves who formerly lived in the Southern Islands, will be forming their independent commune. From there, the dwarves will be able to create and receive commissions freely, unlike in the past, and by doing so they will contribute their strength to the economy of the new city. The king of Shimuan's face crumpled at this news about the dwarves. Originally, the dwarves and their skills had been virtually monopolized by the kings of Shimuan, but during the construction of the new city, all of the dwarves who had been living on the islands of Shimuan began preparing to move to the continent. However, out of fear of Eugene, the king of Shimuan couldn't even express any of his complaints regarding this. From the industrial zone, Noir then launched into a full-scale tour of the city. They were shown past the city hall, which stood ready to listen to any complaints of the city's citizens, the guild complex, the library, the park and the downtown area. The new city had been installed with more warp gates than any other city on the continent. There were also floating stations in the sky above the city that controlled the city's weather while also providing access to flying carriages that gave a great view of the city below. And below the city there was a subway just like the one in Giabella City. Thanks to that, even though the tour group had visited many different landmarks, it was still daytime when the tour finally ended. The new city looks even more beautiful at night, Noir promised with a grin as she looked at the sun slowly setting in the sky. And such a beautiful night view can only truly be complemented by a splendid festival. Now then, since it has reached this hour, shall we head back to the city gates? Hundreds of thousands of people had gathered at the city gates, waiting to see the new city. As soon as those gates opened, all of the lights in the city would be turned on, and the festival would begin. Although no one had moved into the city yet, there wouldn't be any problems with running the festival. Noir's vassals, who had lost their jobs with the collapse of Giabella City, would be doing all of the work in the city for today only. If you do anything strange, I'll kill you, Eugene threatened Noir. I'm already deceased, Noir pointed out. Eugene frowned gravely, saying, do you want to know what it feels like to die a second time? When you say it like that instead of a warning, it actually sounds quite a tempting promise, you know that? Noir teased. Eugene shot the grinning Noir a glare. Fine, I understand. Haven't I already said that I won't show anyone a fantasy or a dream? I also won't steal any life force. In the first place, there's no longer any need for me to suck out someone's life force, Noir said with a giggle as she pointed up to the city walls. Well then, shall we get going? There was still a lot of work that needed to be done before the end of the inauguration ceremony. The crowds of people who had been making a fuss in front of the tightly shut city gates all cheered when they saw the group of people who had suddenly appeared on top of the gates. Do I really have to do this? Eugene turned to Noir and asked, his face twisted in a scowl. Of course you do. This is truly the whole point of the inaugural ceremony, Noir answered firmly. She still hadn't taken off her hard hat. Now then, everyone line up quickly. I really don't want to do this, Eugene groaned. This act is one that will truly signify the opening of your new fief, Gilead said encouragingly. In contrast to Eugene's uneasy muttering, Gilead showed great enthusiasm for this next part of the ceremony. He stepped forward with Ancilla, whose smile seemed to be trembling slightly. Since the patriarch had already stepped forward, it really couldn't be helped. Guion stood next to Gilead and sent Eugene an encouraging glance. Then Cyan led Isla by the hand to stand next to his father, while Seal also stepped forward to stand next to Ancilla. Father. A silent vermouth was also dragged forward by Carmen. Next came Gerhard. Tucking his tear-soaked handkerchief into a pocket, Eugene's father stepped forward. Now that everyone else had gone forward, Eugene sighed deeply before moving forward to stand next to Gerhard. Sienna Meridian. Moore turned and called out her name. Sienna stuttered. Why are you calling me? I guess you have no intention of truly becoming part of the Lionheart family? If that's the case, there's no need for you to step forward, Moore muttered. Sienna, who had been trying to sneak away, was left with no choice but to fall in line following this murmur. She quickly took the place next to Eugene. Sister, Christina said as she grabbed Anissa's arm and pulled her forward. This would be Anissa's first time standing in front of so many people since she had started possessing her doll's body. Please hold on a second, Christina, Anisse stammered. At least let me get into your body first. No, never mind, if you just stand there on your own, they'll just assume I'm standing there with you. You can't do that, Christina said, refusing to allow Anisse to run away or hide. In the end, Anisse had no choice but to step forward along with Christina. She was worried that the crowd might make fun of her, but the already riled-up crowd didn't show any confused reaction upon seeing Anisse, who had died and become an angel but was now standing next to Christina, apparently alive and well. Eugene turned and scolded the two remaining children. You two should also be standing up here, so what are you waiting for? I was just waiting for you to call me Sir Eugene, Mare said with a cheeky smile. Benefactor, the fact that you are calling us to stand with you, does that mean we will still get to live with you from now on? Rhaenyra asked excitedly. Eugene scoffed and said, Were you planning to move out? Get over here already so we can finish this quickly. Mare and Rhaenyra quickly hurried over to stand in front of Eugene. They were too short to stand next to him like the others were. Now then, Noir said, looking at the members of the main family all lined up together with a satisfied expression. She clapped her hands together. At this signal, a colorful ribbon appeared in front of the members of the main family. Noir handed a pair of platinum scissors to each of them before saying with a bright smile, Please cut the ribbon on my signal. After passing out the scissors, Noir quickly moved to the back of the crowd. Left standing in front of hundreds of thousands of people, all looking up at him with eyes full of anticipation, Eugene gulped nervously as he stood in the center of the group. Smiles please, Noir whispered from behind as everyone obediently burst into smiles. With this, we will soon be cutting the ribbon to announce the opening of the Lionheart's new city. Now then 1, 2, 3. Eugene kept a forced smile on his face as he cut the tape with his scissors. Heawea. Their excitement reached its peak, and the crowd let out a loud cheer as fireworks erupted all across the sky. The tape that had been cut into dozens of lengths transformed into flower petals that fluttered beautifully through the air. Creak. The closed city gates began to swing open. At that moment, Noir's eyes shone with light as she shouted, Don't push the people in front of you or standing next to you. Please enter the city slowly. Don't run in the city. Please enjoy the festival and your tour of the new city while maintaining order at all times. Noir had activated her demon eye of fantasy as she called out these instructions. Over the long course of Noir's life, her demon eye of fantasy had never been used for such a mundane purpose as it had just now. The powerful hypnosis that was affecting hundreds of thousands of minds at the same time led the crowd to enter the city in an orderly manner as if all of the excitement they had been showing just now had disappeared. We should get going as well, Eugene said, shaking off the flower petals stuck to his body. Anisse nodded and turned to the side saying, Sir Vermouth. Vermouth let out a sigh of relief as Anisse approached him. Pulling his arms free of the tight hold that Carmen and Melkith had at some point gotten him into, Vermouth quickly responded with a nod. Anise. Why don't the 6 of us go and enjoy the festival as a group? Anise suggested. Yeah. Of course we should. Lady Carmen, Lady Melkith, please allow me to take my leave, Vermouth said before approaching his companions with a bright smile. As a group? You're not actually planning to run away, are you? Seal asked with a glare, feeling suspicious due to their earlier precedent. No way, Eugene said with a smile, throwing his arm across Vermouth's shoulder as the latter stood beside him. In the campus plaza at Dinah's Academy. Why have we come here? Vermouth asked. All of the other places will be filled with people. However, this place is still closed, so no one can come in uninvited, Eugene explained. The gates to the new city may have been thrown open, but the Academy's gates were still closed. Vermouth nodded in acceptance of Eugene's response, commenting, I see. Standing in front of the 6 statues, Vermouth looked up at his own statue. The statue had been made by a skilled dwarven craftsman and was so exquisitely detailed that it almost looked as if it were alive. For a few moments, Vermouth couldn't help but lose himself in examining his statue, which had a faint smile on its face. Whether it's statues or portraits, ever since the war ended 300 years ago, I've seen plenty that were made of me. Most of them weren't made with me standing up, but this one, Vermouth trailed off. This time it felt different. Agreeing to the dwarven craftsman's request, Vermouth had stood in front of him and modeled for the sculpture. Unlike 300 years ago, he had had no reason to refuse, nor had he felt any desire to. I have never liked the statues and paintings made of me, so I have never looked at any of them deeply. However, this one, it's a strange feeling, Vermouth said with a quiet laugh as he shook his head. But it's not a bad feeling. My chest, it feels warm. Is that so? Eugene responded. Eugene and the rest of the party were standing behind Vermouth. I never thought that I would actually feel this way. But that's only natural since I never thought that a day like this would actually come, Vermouth said as he turned his gaze to the rest of the buildings that made up Dinah's Academy. Now that the new city had finished construction, the Academy would begin recruiting students and faculty in earnest, and admissions would start next year. Vermouth smiled once more as he thought of the many students who would be coming here to learn something. Dinah's Academy. There is no better name to symbolize this place, Vermouth said with a sigh. Why is that? Eugene asked. That's because Hamel, you are able to do so many things, Vermouth said proudly. You were able to do all of the things that I couldn't. And the reason everything now exists the way that it does is the life that you lived as Hamel. Neither Sienna nor Molen or Anise had had anything to do with Ogoroth. They were all Hamel's companions. That also applied to Vermouth. He hadn't actually known Ogoroth personally. The person that Vermouth had first met was and would always be Hamel Dinah's. The world that you saved will continue into the future, and the students of Dinah's Academy will be the ones to cultivate that future. This means, in a way, your name has gained its immortality, Vermouth chuckled as he turned to look back at the others. Eugene, Sienna, Molen, and Anise were standing in a line behind him. For some reason, Christina was standing slightly apart from the others. Vermouth tilted his head as he took in the strange sight his companions were making. A bit uncertainly he asked, Why are you all standing like that? Vermouth, Eugene said with a wide smile. Molen, Sienna, and Anise also had similar smiles. Vermouth returned his companions' smiles with his own. Seeing this smile, Eugene threw his cloak open. Flutter. What fell out of the cloak was a rolled-up rug made from spun straw. Vermouth blinked in confusion, not knowing what he was looking at. He asked, What is that? A picnic blanket. Something similar, Eugene replied as he spread the unrolled rug across the ground before continuing to speak. This is something that we used to use in my hometown of Taraz. It's called a straw mat. Is that so? Vermouth said curiously. I have to admit my hometown was extremely rural even for Taraz, and it had a certain custom that the people living in the city wouldn't be familiar with, Eugene commented idly. A custom? Vermouth didn't know why Hamel had suddenly brought up such a topic, but since Hamel had mentioned that it was a custom from his hometown, Vermouth asked out of pure curiosity, What kind of custom was it? It will be faster to demonstrate it than it would be to try and explain it. After carefully spreading the mat to lie flat on the ground, Eugene stood up and told Vermouth, Lie down here. Huh. Vermouth was puzzled. I said lie down already, Eugene said, rushing Vermouth. Vermouth still didn't understand what was going on. However, since all of his companions were smiling, he just tilted his head to the side curiously as he stepped onto the mat. You want me to lie down on this? Vermouth asked uncertainly. The mat he was stepping on seemed quite coarse. He had thought it was meant to be a picnic blanket so they could sit on the grass and have some drinks, but he was being told to lie down on it? Vermouth felt a bit uneasy, but he still did as he was told and laid down on the mat. This doesn't really feel like it should be used as bedding, Vermouth slowly observed. Click-click-click. The moment Vermouth had lain down, Sienna's spell was activated. The end of the mat rose and wrapped around Vermouth until he was rolled up tight. What they? Vermouth yelped. Startled, Vermouth tried to struggle free of the mat, but while it might have been possible for him to do that 300 years ago, it was impossible even for Vermouth to escape from Sienna's spell now. All he could do after being wrapped up in the mat was wriggle his body around, rolling the mat across the ground like a worm. Eugene immediately pulled some dark-stained clubs out of his cloak and handed them to his companions. Get him! Eugene shouted. Off! Molin let out a roar as he raised his club high into the air. Illustration 1. Die! Sienna also ran up to Vermouth, swinging her club with both hands. Illustration. Ashes to ashes. Anise called out a prayer of mourning when she took her turn raining down blows with her club. Illustration 3. Oh Lord! Christina, the only one not holding a club, fell to her knees and prayed. Bam! Pow! Crack! This son of a bitch! Yarg! Hoo-hoo! Gack! Watch out for your ribs! Caw-awk! Go ahead and die already! Kahyuk! Gilead, who had just been enjoying a glass of wine, ignored the way his wine was spilling down the front of his shirt as he stared up at the sky. High up in the sky, where everyone in the city could see it, a video was being played of the great Vermouth, the founding ancestor of the Lionheart clan, being clubbed by his comrades as he was wrapped up in a mat, unable to put up any resistance. Gilead's jaw had dropped at this shocking sight, allowing a sip of wine to spill out from the corner of his mouth. What is going on? Gilead stammered. Everyone felt the same sense of shock as they watched the video being played in the sky. The beating was taking place in the campus plaza of Dinah's Academy, right in front of the statues of the 6 heroes. The great Vermouth was letting out groans and cries of pain as he was unable to defend himself against the rain of clubs that were being slammed down onto him. This video wasn't just being broadcast in the skies about the Lionheart's new city. Sienna's spell was perfect in its coverage. Just like in the past during Eugene's duel against Gavid, the baptism of violence that Vermouth was experiencing was being broadcast all across the continent. Stop, please stop. What do you mean stop, you bastard? Illustration 4. We've still got a lot left to go. We aren't going to kill you, so don't worry about that. Hey, now it looks like a lot of your bones are broken. Let me heal them for you. Even though his bones were crushed into dust, the violence didn't end. After Vermouth's body was engulfed in light, and all of his wounds were immediately healed, the beating resumed once more. Gah! Vermouth cried out in agony. It hurts. Vermouth was all too familiar with various kinds of mental anguish. He was also well acquainted with the agony that was felt when one's whole body was being torn into little pieces. So Vermouth had the confidence to say that it would take more than just a moderate amount of pain before he would even let out a single groan. However, he wasn't able to endure the current agony that he was experiencing. He couldn't even defend himself because both his arms were firmly pinned to his side by the mat wrapped around him. If this had just been an ordinary beating, it wouldn't have even scratched Vermouth's skin, let alone broken any of his bones. But right now, the strength of each of the 4 people who were beating Vermouth was strong enough that any of them could easily break Vermouth's bones. And the heavy pain that was somehow being transmitted through all of the layers of rolled-up matting was sinking deep into Vermouth's bones. Just how on earth had these things been created? Their clubs weren't breaking despite all the force put behind their swings, and the mat hadn't even torn after being struck so many times. On top of that, this ordeal of violence couldn't be escaped by falling unconscious. Whenever Vermouth felt like he was about to faint, Anice's miracles immediately woke him up. And even if his bones were broken, they would be healed immediately. Stop, please just stop. Vermouth begged. I was wrong, it's all my fault. Eugene snorted and said, We already know that you were in the wrong. So don't apologize. Tiana scolded. Molan nodded, saying, That's right, just accept your beating. Sir Vermouth, your sins have already been forgiven, Anise said in consolation even as her club kept swinging through the air. Bam bam. Crack. Pow. Despite Vermouth's pleas, the beating continued. Mercifully, the beating was solely aimed at the parts of Vermouth's body that were rolled up in the mat, and no one tried to target his head. Gah! In the end, Vermouth gave up all resistance and could only groan and scream in time with the beatings, praying earnestly in his heart for this terrible stretch of time to pass quickly. Bam bam bam. Christina kept her eyes closed and continued praying even as the sounds of the clubs landing their blows streamed into her ears. She couldn't bear to join in on their beating of the great hero. However, with that said, she didn't try to mediate and stop the violence either. At the very least, in Christina's opinion, Vermouth did deserve this beating. Huff, huff, huff. Eugene panted heavily as he put down his club, sweat dripping down his forehead. The sun was slowly setting and the sky was covered in its soft red glow. The clubbing had continued until the point where even Eugene was left exhausted. He felt tempted to activate ignition and continue beating Vermouth, but if he did that, Vermouth might actually die. Illustration 5. Gag Gafk. Still rolled up in a mat, Vermouth looked like a dried-up corpse. His once neatly arranged hair was a tousled mess, his pale skin was covered in dirt and blood was foaming around his lips. His half-lidded eyes were golden and cloudy, just like they were back when he was sealing away the Demon King of Destruction. Aha, ahaha. At this sight, Sienna felt like a bubble of tension had burst within her, leaving her with a refreshing sensation. It was a much different feeling from that time long ago when Vermouth had actually blown a hole straight through her chest. Ha ha ha. Molan also burst into a hearty peal of laughter as he set down his club. For over 100 years, Molan had single-mindedly hunted the Nur, and never once during all that time had he ever let out a smile. Molan had never resented Vermouth for burdening him with such a life without any apparent hope of salvation in sight. However, even without being burdened by such resentment, he had still felt the urge to beat up Vermouth more than once, so he was in a very good mood right now. Ahaha. Anise laughed as she shook the flask she had taken out of her pocket. In fact, Anise had never once been directly harmed by Vermouth's actions. At most, she had just been inconvenienced after she was forced to preside over his funeral despite Vermouth having faked his death. However, just because she wasn't harmed didn't mean she had never gotten the urge to beat Vermouth up. And wasn't it a fact that she had suffered a lot because of Vermouth, who had silently kept everything to himself? With this, all of our hard feelings have finally been cleared, Eugene said to Vermouth, who was still writhing in pain. There was no response. Vermouth wasn't in any condition to say anything. Anise giggled as she began to heal Vermouth. Congratulations, Christina said. She approached Eugene with a handkerchief from the side where she had been kneeling down and praying. She wiped the sweat off Eugene's face with a soft smile as she said, Now everything truly has ended. The end, Eugene muttered as he caught his breath. The end. It was just as Christina had said. Now everything truly had ended. The Demon King of Incarceration was dead. The Demon King of Destruction had also died. The demon folk still remained, but they could no longer run wild like they once had. In the world to come, the demon folk would become just another race living alongside the humans and the other races. The elections going on in Helmuth still weren't over just yet, but whoever the winner was, once they were finally confirmed, they would be left with no choice but to develop friendlier relations with the other countries. Dinah's academy had also completed construction. Eugene had finally achieved the dream he had been carrying ever since he was Hamel. Molan had already founded his own country. But instead of returning to the royal family of Ruhr, where his descendants now ruled, he had said that he intended to stay in the forest next to the Lionheart Mansion. Sienna had yet to build her lakeside mansion, but even though there wasn't a lake, they already had both a forest and a mansion. She had said that she wanted to live in the mansion along with Eugene and continue to educate young wizards by going back and forth between the academy and Aratha's lecture halls. While doing so, she also intended to find the spare time to develop new magic and write up a new book of spells. Of course, the first thing she would be writing wouldn't be a book of spells, but instead, a fairy tale titled The Legend of Balzac. Anise wouldn't be returning to Uraz. Her dream was to run a bar that doubled as an inn. The building had already been constructed for her, but its interior had yet to be decorated. Anise had said that it was just a daydream that she once had and that she didn't have any real intention of running the business. But, judging from the fact that she had met up with several merchants by using Ancilla's connections, it seemed that that issue had yet to be fully determined. Just like Anise, Christina wouldn't be returning to Euros either. She would also be staying with the Lionhearts. She seemed a little hesitant about giving lectures at the academy, but judging from the fact that she was secretly encouraging Anise to do so together, it seemed like she did have some intention of giving lessons on theology. Everyone was now busy pursuing their dreams. They had arrived at an end that couldn't really be called an end, as it was an end that would just lead into their new future. Just like they had so longed for 300 years ago, they were finally happy. But was that really the case? Could things really end like this? Was this truly a happy ending? Eugene silently stared at Chrysitna's face. The warmth of her hand was transmitted through the handkerchief that was wiping his cheek. Christina tilted her head in confusion at his intent gaze. Her blue eyes sparkled like jewels as Eugene looked into them. "Sir Eugene? Is something the matter?" Christina asked. Eugene remained silent. Had she always been this beautiful? Seeing Christina's face from such a close distance, Eugene couldn't help but think about how pretty she was. Eugene coughed and turned his head. He was now looking at Anise, who was still drinking from her flask. "What's the matter?" Anise asked with a smile as she lowered her flask from her lips. Her appearance was still slightly disheveled after having recently worked up a sweat. Transparent beads of sweat were running down her cheeks. Her eyes were curved in a deep smile. Had she always been like this? Was Anise really always this pretty? She was similar to Christina but also distinct from Christina. Eugene gulped as he turned his gaze once more. This time his gaze landed on Sienna, who was taking off her hat. "What are you looking at?" Sienna snapped, her cheeks a little red, perhaps out of excitement. No, perhaps it was because her skin was dyed by the setting sun. Sienna's refreshed smile as she used her hat as a fan set Eugene's heart throbbing. Eugene silently raised his head. He looked up at the 6 statues, the buildings that made up Dinah's academy, and the red sunset that was looming behind all of them. Agarotha's wish had been to slay all of the demon kings. Hamel's wish was to kill the demon kings and then build an academy on his return home. Eugene had taken the unfulfilled regrets from his past life as his wish in this life. He had fulfilled his wish by slaying the demon kings. He had also built this academy. Now that everything had been wrapped up, that still left Eugene's wish. A wish that didn't have anything to do with Agaroth or Hamel. "Let's get married," Eugene suddenly said. They had just thoroughly beaten up vermouth. The completed academy looked quite amazing. And the sunset was truly beautiful. After having lived through 2 lives, Eugene had finally learned to live for the present. He felt a great sense of satisfaction and an unprecedented level of peacefulness wash over him. And Sienna, Anise and Christina looked especially beautiful today. As such, Eugene had said those words without really thinking them through. "Let's get married." He had been planning on asking them this question after giving it another year or so, but the current circumstances surrounding Eugene and the emotions evoked within him had caused him to blurt out his true feelings without any preparation. His sudden proposal was met with silence. Sienna stared at Anise. Anise looked to Christina. Christina turned to Sienna. Right now all 3 of them were feeling the same emotion. "Who are you going to get married to?" Molen asked cautiously. No matter how much Molen thought about it, this didn't feel like the right time. Molen wondered if he could still stop Eugene before his friend made a mistake. But before Molen could even finish his thoughts, Eugene had already replied. "Sienna, Anise and Christina," Eugene confidently stated. Molen held his tongue. "Please marry me," Eugene repeated his proposal. Molen closed his eyes. His sudden proposal was also caught by the spell which was still broadcasting this scene to the rest of the city and the whole of the continent. There were countless sighs and many exclamations from the unwitting audience to Eugene's proposal. Sienna silently stared at Eugene, her shoulders shaking. Her face was now completely red. This shade wasn't because of the sunset or due to embarrassment or even because of her joy. "Why would you ask us that now?" Sienna barely managed to keep her voice level as she squeezed out this question. "Hamel, are you insane?" Anise asked, her eyes flashing like a snake's behind her crooked eye smile. "Sir Eugene, What you said just now has made me extremely happy, but... Christina staggered backward and sighed. I didn't want to hear those words at a place like this. That's right. Sienna chimed in with a shout. I agree with Christina. Anise also nodded along vigorously. Still intoxicated by the situation and his emotions, Eugene couldn't understand the trio's reactions. What's wrong with this? Eugene asked in confusion. What do you mean, what's wrong? Do you really not know the answer to that? Sienna yelled. Who would bring up such an important matter in a place like this, while we're all standing around holding clubs? Anise complained. Did you at least bring rings? Christina asked patiently. Only for Eugene to helplessly shut his eyes in embarrassment as he desperately began rummaging through his cloak. Hamel. Swish. Rolling himself free of the mat, Vermouth staggered to his feet. Without even wiping his blood-stained lips, Vermouth's bloodshot eyes widened in glee as he told Eugene, lie down. Why should I? Eugene nervously asked. Because everyone is going to want you to lie down soon, Vermouth said in satisfaction. Eugene turned to look at Sienna, Anise and Christina. Sienna and Anise, who had already been holding clubs, raised their clubs with both hands. Christina, who had taken a few steps backward while Eugene was searching his cloak, slowly strode over to Eugene and plucked the club from his hands. I don't want any part in this, Mullen said as he handed the club he was holding to Vermouth. Eugene silently alternated between looking at the mat and everyone else, a bewildered expression on his face. What are you doing? Sienna asked. Please lie down, said Anise. I'm sorry, Sir Eugene, Christina apologized. Lie down already, Vermouth impatiently insisted. Ahem, Eugene cleared his throat. The thought suddenly occurred to him. Should he just try to run away? However, if he ran away from this place right now, he got the feeling that he would never be able to return to this place ever again. The feelings that had previously intoxicated Eugene had already cooled down, allowing him to reflect on his mistakes calmly. Please be gentle, Eugene said in a small voice as he lay down on the edge of the mat. Then he rolled over, wrapping the mat around his body all by himself. Die. Accompanied by Sienna's scream, the clubs began to fall. The